a useful debate, and I hope that it will lead to some changes, though I'm not convinced that it will. Ross Finney, Ian McKee and others have talked about the history of the disease, and I don't want to reiterate that, but I think I would take Brian Adams' point very well, that in 1999, if anyone had said to us that we would be debating this as one of the main public health challenges, I think people would have said, why? And that's why the figures have changed, because MRSA and C. difficile were not a massive problem in 1999. They grew as a problem, and the previous government began to tackle it, and I acknowledge that this government is trying to tackle it. I don't say that it's not. What we are doing in opposition is trying to point out the areas in which we think improvements can be made. And can I say, before I go any further, that I recommend reading the Public Accounts Committee report from Westminster on the 10th of November this year issued, which shows that MRSA and C. difficile are only actually 20% of the healthcare-acquired infections. So we have a major problem still ahead of us. And if anybody thinks that C. difficile is going to be the last type of infection that we have to deal with, then they will be sorely discommoded. Now, the trends are there, and they are very welcome, and there's no doubt about that drop that has occurred. And that is in part because of the measures that have been put in place by our government and by the succeeding government. The surveillance, which the Cabinet Secretary has acknowledged as being important, was initially voluntary, but as the C. diff developed, it became clear it needed to be mandatory. That drop is welcome, but as Cathy Jimison has said, the drop is not as great as it is in England. Now, that's a fact. It's a fact. We may not like it, but it is a fact. And the fact that some of the trusts have actually dropped by 80% in England is really very significant. So we have to think, why is the drop less?
I appreciate Richard Simpson's tone so far, but would he concede that one of the reasons that the drop has been faster in England was that they started mandatory surveillance of C. diff 2 years earlier than Scotland did, and therefore they knew the extent of the problem and how to tackle it much earlier?
I don't think actually that was the reason. If you read the report of the PAC and the previous report, you'll find it was actually implementing a tough, robust, legislated for inspection regime. And that's what our motion is about. It's not calling for a new one. I don't know how the Liberals have got this idea that we're looking for a new regime. We're not. What we're looking for is a rapid and robust response by someone in government when there's an outbreak. Now, we've had 4 outbreaks since the Vale of Leven: Orkney, Highland, Grampian and now Tayside. This year alone, we've had 3 outbreak reports and new guidance from the Health Protection Scotland. Nanette Milne and others have referred to the fact that we don't actually need a lot more guidance. We've had 130 pages of report this year, and there are 31 linked documents to guidelines, protocols, toolkits and further guidance. There is a plethora of information out there that, as the RCN is saying, is stressing the frontline staff because matters are not clear. And if that wasn't enough, and I repeat what I said in the previous debate, we have a clutter of organisations, from the government itself issuing CEL letters, through the HITF, the task force, HPS, Health Facilities Scotland, NHS Quiz, the Health Environment Inspectorate, the Care Commission, which I acknowledge is now beginning to do some work in this. This is clutter. And Nanette Milne called for clarity, and I would absolutely agree with her. We must have things much clearer so as the frontline staff understands. And if the Cabinet Secretary does not accept this point, let me refer to the website of HPS, that they have not got general access to the outbreak control information on SHPIR, which is the information thing. It isn't there. And it says, we are currently developing a managing incidents and outbreaks section. And at present, the SPHIR is not a publicly available resource, but we may consider changing this in future. That is what our motion is about. It's about adequate information, timiously given, and in full information. Now, turning to the Nine Wells outbreak, which, as others have said, I went to the briefing on this. First of all, I would say and suggest to the Cabinet Secretary she should read the SPSO, the Ombudsman's report, on the Mr A case, because that demonstrates that there were significant problems there already. And that complaint about unhygienic things was upheld. Lots of things that were problems. We've quoted from the letters with the person's permission about the really appalling circumstances that were occurring with one particular patient, and this is unacceptable. But I will say, and agree with the Cabinet Secretary, that the outbreak itself was handled extremely well by them. It wasn't faulted. And HBS, when they came in 10 days later, did say that it had been handled well. But I asked the management why they hadn't asked HBS to come in earlier, and they said, well, we didn't ask them until we actually saw some slight peculiarities that we needed advice on. They were the experts. They've seen the previous outbreaks. They should have been in there on day one, not to order around, not even necessarily to order the ward closed, because that was done already. But what they should be there to do is to offer the experience of their advice. And you have just said that's not going to happen. So I think that should happen, or the inspectorate should have gone in. Now, can I say to the Cabinet Secretary another point? The index, the confusion that arose and the attack that the staff felt was quite dismaying on their competence was because of the press release which said that the index case was some 10 weeks earlier, and therefore it looked like a cover-up. And that was where the circumstances arose for the press releases that were dismaying to the staff. Now, when the 3 index cases occurred and the outbreak was declared and the ward was closed, the board took a deliberate decision on the basis of protecting the patient and their families from press harassment that they wouldn't tell the public. Now, the question is that acceptable or not? When I asked the management why they didn't announce until 6th of November, they said they waited till the outbreak had concluded. I said, well, what if it hadn't concluded on the 6th of November? At what point would you have informed the public? And their response was, we would value clear guidance from the Cabinet Secretary as to how to manage the press. And if that was the first request for that, I would understand and not criticise. But it's in the NHS quiz report as well. There is a specific statement in the Orkney, Grampian and you may shake your head, Cabinet Secretary, but it's there, saying precisely this, that there is a need for a much clearer management of the media and the press in order to the provision of public information. Now, I say to the Conservatives and Liberals, we will support the government in the measures they're doing, but we will also criticise. That is the point. Going back to this index case again, Tayside have a system in which they can identify the 027 strain within 2 hours of a sample being tested. And when I asked why they weren't testing all samples, they said it was too expensive. Now, I pass this on to the Cabinet Secretary. I'm sure the Minister, who was the Public Health Minister who was there, will pass that on as well. If the index case had been actually seen and diagnosed in August from the testing at that point, which they didn't do because of cost, then I say that lives might have been saved. And that's a very serious statement to make. But it's very serious, because I would ask, because if 027 is recognised, people become hyper-vigilant. The cleaning measures that are put in place that have been described in this letter as occurring in September would have led to a much sooner, greater intervention. So I would ask for that to be looked at. Now, antimicrobial policy, which is being considered. Of course that is hugely important. But I say to the Cabinet Secretary again that from our own reports to our own government, from our own organisation, NHS Quiz, there are repeated reports that there is a policy there, but it is not being followed. When I raised the issue of the hospital pharmacists and said there was problems with recruitment and retention, I was blown away. Not a problem. Isn't occurring. Dundee management admitted to me that the recruitment and retention of pharmacists are a problem because the community pharmacists are now paid much more. So again, I would ask the government to look at this. I want to finish, presiding officer, sorry, I switched to presiding officer by saying what we need is clear guidance, clear information, reduced clutter, robust and timious inspection team. We need clarity and resources in order to tackle this issue. That is all we want. We acknowledge what the government's doing. We acknowledge that the staff are making huge efforts. But we need to have that clarity of purpose. And frankly, on the issue of media management and information, we need the Cabinet Secretary to acknowledge the current web portal is sadly inadequate, and the mechanisms for dealing with an outbreak in terms of media, which is her responsibility, is not adequate either. I support the motion in my name, and we support the Liberal amendment, but not the government's amendment.